I am a descendant of Ute Indians of my mother and father's side from the Middle Savannah River in South Carolina. The Ute Indians that were in Savannah River, those that didn't go west, ended up in Indian slavery. Most people don't understand Indian slavery. Indian slavery was the first enslavement in this country. Started back in the 1500s with the Spanish, lasted up until the 1751 when the King of England decided that there would be no more Indian slaves, but it continued on. And the Indians that were in slavery in South Carolina was coded as Negroes, and South Carolina made no distinction between the classes of African slaves and Indian slaves. Virginia in 1682 passed a couple of acts, and one of those acts was Indians and Africans that are enslaved would be classed as Negroes. And that's something most people don't understand. Then getting back to South Carolina, Indian slavery lasted up until 1865. But South Carolina didn't end slavery itself until 1907, and most people don't even know that. Now, Scottish and Irish slavery was second. Then the British ended that slavery in 1839. But most people don't know about Scottish and Irish slavery. I'm familiar with it because my parents told me about it. And I knew a lot about it from experience I got with them. So we knew. South Carolina had over 75,000 Scottish and Irish slaves and over 150,000 Native American slaves. Most of the Native American slaves ended up in the Caribbean. So even today, many of them down in the Caribbean are known as Arawaks, but you have some Ute, Swanee, Cherokee, and many others, Savannah, many others, etc., down in the Caribbean. So learning my history, I had an aunt, and Aunt Laura. My Aunt Laura lived to be 114 years old, and she mentored to me, and she never allowed me to write anything down when I spoke to her. Couldn't write nothing when we conversed back and forth. Nothing. Baby, write it in your mind. So I had to memorize everything she taught me, and I had to look her in the eye, pay attention. My Aunt Laura valued time by saying many moons. That was her favorite quote. It was many moons ago from there. It was many moons since I've been here. Many moons since that happened. But having the luxury of having my Aunt Laura, she was a little girl when Sherman came through. She was about 6 years old. So she could tell me these things. A lot of folks don't even understand the effects of that. So my Aunt Laura, her mother lived to be 100 years old, and she knew her grandmother. And she would always say to me, baby, you may be black, but you ain't come from Africa, you from right here. So having that history, and my history goes back to 1725, documented, of Ute Indians. One of the most important things with that is being able to go back and forth. I will never say that there's no European or African in my ancestry because I don't know what is beyond that point. Many free Africans slave Africans, slave Europeans, and free Europeans assembled among the Native Americans. A lot of people don't even know that. And that's one thing about the Southeast Native Americans. A lot of us have an admixture. So I always question folks when they talk about full bloods. That depends on the timeline and who ascended among the tribes. These things are key. Now, because of assimilation and because of slavery, it's something very important that I want everyone to listen to. Do not omit different colors that's listed on the census of your ancestry. Too many times, white Americans run into roadblocks. Black Americans run into roadblocks. Because Native Americans was deemed one time as free people of color, depending on the community that your ancestor lived in with the majority of people, they are classified as white, they're classified as Negro, they're classified as mulatto. So when you come across genealogical documents that says Negro, if you're Caucasian, do not omit that if you're looking for your Native American ancestors, because you may find them there. If you are black and you're looking for your Native American ancestry and you come across something that's white, do not omit it. I teach genealogy from a forensic standpoint. I was taught to examine. So all the old stories that I got, I wanted to validate it. I know who I am. I know who my ancestor said I am. Let's see where the paper trail takes us. So I spent 10 years digging into the Colonial archives. I would go in the archives as if I was going out picking plums or picking blackberries. I wouldn't read in the beginning. I just gathered all the information, all the books I could get my hands on. And I began to build my libraries. Before I read one book, I collected books for about 2 years. So today, in my digital archives, over a 15-year span, I have over 15,000 digital documents. Focus on the census. Now you have to be very careful with the census because there's all different schedules with the census. What most people should do is study the 1910 to 1913 census. Now, federal census is every 10 years. State census every 5 years. Your county or township is every 2 or 3 years because you had a lot of migration of people moving in and out. Always start with your local level first. You have your church records, which I would say to anybody, if you're researching your ancestors from the 1700s on back, dig into the colonial church records. Books on Methodism of Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. These documents are crucial because they deal with Native American missions by John Wesley and Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury is very key with the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I'm going to focus on that because that church was once the Colored Methodist Church. And the Colored Methodist Church is for the Church of Free People of Color. That was your natives or part natives. See, you have to study migrations. And why I'm saying that? Because Virginia had a great migration in the late 1600s, about 1680. And Virginia expelled 66,000 free Africans. So one would say, wow, how did that many Africans ended up in Virginia in 1680 that was free? Well, we're going to have to get beyond that by looking at immigrations and studying the pre-colonial period in Britain and Spain. Most importantly, British. There are Africans who have lived in Britain in the 1400s, even the 1200s. They've been there for a very long time. So as you look into immigrations, and the first thing you should say is no longer say that these names are European. It's better felt, and you get more research by saying Christian. Because many free Africans came across the borders through immigration, named John Wilson, John Adams, John Henry, Louis Jefferson, and they're not white. This is in the 1600s. Many of them came as indentured servants. They came as indentured servants because they had to pay their way over. So they worked for so many years. Britain also had what they call convicts. And over 300,000 convicts were sent to the U.S., to the colonies, in penal states, penal colonies. And many of these convicts settled along with the slaves. Now, Britain had a habit of sending a huge number of Scottish and Irish women as convicts for even biting an apple wrong. If you go back and read some of those laws, it's totally ridiculous what they were sentenced for back then. As a result of that, a lot of these women married African men. A lot of the African men married Native women. This should be understood in Virginia. Well, some say, well, Chief, I don't buy that. Well, what you have to do now is go back and look at the laws. One of the most important things in genealogy is understanding the laws. Because there was so much intermingling going on that Virginia decided that the issue of a mulatto from Virginia standard was a white woman and an African. That's the first one in the colony. Now, Spain, when we deal with the Spanish, because a lot of the early colonial laws developed and were adopted from some Spanish pre-existing law. Now, the Spanish definition of a mulatto, Indian, or a Negro